The Third Reich, Nazi Germany, is known for its crimes against humanity during the Second World War. Yet on a very few occasions, the Germans themselves were outraged by the violence that was conducted by units allied to them. We already saw they were displeased with the Ustasha, Croatian ultranationalist violence in Axis-occupied Yugoslavia, but they also raised their eyebrows when soldiers of the SS RONA under Bronislav Kaminsky conducted an orgy of violence in Warsaw during the uprising of 1944. Kaminsky was therefore punished. Why? And why did the equally notorious Oskar Dirlewanger, who was guilty of similar crimes in the same area, went unpunished? We have a lot to unpack here. Hey, good to have you back on the channel. If you're new, I'm Stefan, I'm a Dutch history teacher, and I love taking a deep dive into these niche historical topics. I covered a lot. If you find this stuff interesting and you have not subscribed yet, please do so. Also hit that notification bell, and you can support me financially via PayPal, Patreon, via Super Thanks, or you can buy me a coffee. A couple of years ago I talked about the infamous Kaminsky Brigade, also known as the SS RONA, this Russian Waffen-SS unit. I will put a link at the end screen for those who haven't seen that video to learn more in depth about this unit. And I can imagine it sounds strange. Russians in the Waffen-SS, weren't the Slavs, and especially the Russians, seen as inferior by the Germans? Why were they put in a Waffen-SS formation? Initially, when Operation Barbarossa commenced, Hitler forbade the use of Soviet labor in assistance in conquering the East. Nevertheless, soon the first auxiliary volunteers were mobilized. This happened in secret though, as Hitler was firmly against it. The decision to mobilize Soviet volunteers was a result of a discussion between the Nazi ideologists and the Nazi pragmatists. The Slavs, and especially the Russians, were seen as racially inferior. However, the vast Eastern European lands that were conquered needed to be guarded and cleared of enemy activity, as the war demanded more and more manpower. The first recruits were drawn mostly from non-Russian nationalities, mostly those of the Caucasus and Turkestan. Later, Ukrainians and Cossacks were also recruited, and eventually Russians were able to join. According to historian Richard Overy, an estimated 1 million Soviet men ended up fighting against the USSR, and hundreds of thousands of them, perhaps even 500,000, were ethnic Russians. These were recruited out of military and logistical necessity. Russian POWs could serve as interpreter, wagon and lorry drivers, cooks, medical orderlies, as well as messengers. From August 1941, the Germans set up these so-called security units, these Sicherungsverbände, and these had to clear the rear of enemy activity and fight against Soviet partisans and Red Army stragglers. Around the same time, the SS was setting up similar militias, and one person that served in these militias was Bronislav Kaminsky, and he would later make a career in the branch of Russian volunteers for Germany. Late 1941, the 2nd Panzer Army conducted an experiment on its own initiative in the Bryansk region. During the autumn of 1941, in the small town of Lokot in Oral province, local anti-Soviet militia groups were taking shape spontaneously. By that time, Soviet authority had vanished from the area, and shortly after, the first German reconnaissance units arrived in the area, and they were welcomed by these future Soviet collaborators. A local administration was founded. Technical school teacher Konstantin Voskoboynik became the mayor, and his deputy was Bronislav Kaminsky. In January 1942, Voskoboynik was killed in battle, and thus his deputy, Bronislav Kaminsky, he took over command. He was half German, half Polish, and he had spent time in a Soviet gulag. This is what I read about his background. Bronislav Kaminsky was born in 1899, the son of a Polish father and a German mother near Vitebsk. He studied in Leningrad and worked subsequently as an engineer in the color industry. In the 1920s, he belonged to the anti-Stalin opposition inside the Communist Party, grouped around Nikolai Bukharin, and was among those who signed Bukharin's declaration in 1929, protesting against Stalin's agrarian policy. Kaminsky was arrested in 1935, accused of maintaining contacts with Polish and German intelligence, and was sent to the Soviet labor camp in the Urals area. In 1941, he was released upon his mother's petition and came to Lokot, where he worked as an engineer at the local spares factory. During this time, Kaminsky met Voskoboynik, who dreamed of creating a National Socialist state in Russia. Voskoboynik and Kaminsky can be seen as Russian Nazis. Now, the Germans did not want them to set up a local political party, but as long as they were willing to fight with the Germans against the Soviet partisans, they would be allowed to do so. Kaminsky's militia was named the Russian Liberation National Army, RONA, which should not be confused with the ROA, which was the Russian Liberation Army of Andrey Vlasov. See the end screen for a video on just that. A year later, the RONA had around 10,000 men in its ranks. The situation changed in 1943 because then the Germans started to withdraw, and 6,000 RONA men and around 25,000 civilians were evacuated to Belarusia. They now found themselves as an occupying army in an area where they were harassed by the Soviet partisans mercilessly. One RONA unit defected entirely to the Soviet partisans. It was only in the summer of 1944 that Himmler converted the demoralized unit into a regular division of the Waffen-SS. Now the RONA was the SS RONA, also known as the 29th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, Russian number 1, with Kaminsky as Brigadeführer. Shortly after, in August, they were directed to Warsaw to suppress the uprising of the Polish resistance, the Polish home army against the German occupier. Now Himmler, he acknowledged this uprising as being a partisan uprising, and thus SS units were sent in to suppress it. Erich von den Bach-Zelewski was ordered to crush it. Many SS and police units were sent over to the Polish capital. Also the men of Kaminsky were sent to the area. Their behavior was appalling. They slaughtered thousands of Poles, and their cruelty left ordinary SS men bewildered. In post-war years, all Axis atrocities were blamed on these two units, the Kaminsky and Dirlewanger brigades, and although this was grossly untrue, it can be said that the Germans did not organize cruelty in Warsaw, but rather were negligent in their control of undisciplined troops. Kaminsky and Dirlewanger, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on wickedness. I talked about the Dirlewanger brigade in another video, see the pinned comment. It must be said that many atrocities were ascribed wrongly to RONA, but here's what they did on August 5th, 1944. RONA men entered the Warsaw Hospital for female cancer patients and both the staff and patients. The German 4th East Prussian Grenadier Regiment, which had taken part in suppressing the Warsaw Uprising, complained about the conduct both of Kaminsky's and of Dirlewanger's men. The following day, the 4th East Prussian Regiment began to sneak into the northern suburbs of the city's Kolo district, while the central Wola district was tackled from the west by the Germans. The Ochota district in the south was attacked from the southwest by the complete RONA brigade, now led by Kaminsky in person. Each of the columns had some armored support, and air and artillery backup was available. The commander of the East Prussians had informed the SS that his troops hated to see the atrocities of Kaminsky's and Dirlewanger's men, and he was afraid they might start shooting at each other. Hence, his unit was kept away from the Russians, as all Eastern troops were often referred to. Dirlewanger's troops made progress and reached the Vistula River, and there they cut the home army into two segments. The troops of the Dirlewanger Brigade showed courage, yet little battle sense, as these men, often drunk, fell by the masses. The troops of the SS RONA did not fare so well, as they spent more time looting and pillaging instead of fighting the Polish resistance. German Major General Rohr, who took over command of the battle zone, ordered the atrocities to stop at once. German Commander Stahel agreed. He demanded Bach-Zelewski to withdraw the two brigades and in the meanwhile keep an eye on the Russians. I read Commander Rohr. He caught two RONA men about to molest two Polish girls. He intervened and these Polish girls were thus saved. Von den Bach-Zelewski concurred with Rohr's and Stahel's opinion. Kaminsky had to go. At least Dirlewanger's men were fighting, and besides, Dirlewanger had the protection of Heinrich Himmler himself. Now, in a podcast I was listening about the Warsaw Uprising, it was said that Kaminsky had to answer for his crimes, and he pointed out that his men, who are mostly from the Soviet Union had left their homeland to continue the fight with the Germans and were given a free hand by the SS in Warsaw. In other words, they could loot and pillage as they saw fit. An eyewitness said he saw Kaminsky on a balcony with on his lap 2 women and also holding a bottle of booze. And this here basically shows how undisciplined he and his men were when it came down to following German orders. Kaminsky was then ordered to attend a special conference in Łódź in Waterland. To his subordinates, he expressed his suspicion, but he went anyway. And close to Łódź, he was stopped by German SS police, taken out of the car and shot dead. His body was then put inside the car to make it look like he was ambushed by local partisans. The Germans were afraid that Kaminsky's men would mutiny once they would hear about the demise of their commander, and eventually the subordinates of Kaminsky were allowed to see the ambush site, but it was not convincing. And thus, the SS, a few days later, they changed the story. Kaminsky was executed for stealing jewelry. The SS could hardly deny that atrocities were taking place in Warsaw and then announced that they had executed one of their own generals for committing them. The real reasons why the Germans got rid of Kaminsky and not of Dirlewanger was the fact that Kaminsky's troops were not or barely participating in the fighting against the Polish Home Army, and the men of the Dirlewanger Brigade, despite them also committing heinous crimes against the local population, did contribute to the fighting. Second, Dirlewanger had connections with Himmler and Gottlob Berger. Kaminsky had not. And third, racial views. Dirlewanger was an ethnic German. Kaminsky was seen as racially inferior, as historian Norman Davies puts it. In the eyes of the Nazis, he was a low-grade Slav who had overstayed his welcome in the ranks of his German masters. The remnants of the Kaminsky Brigade would later serve under Soviet collaborator General Vlasov in the 600th Infantry Division, 1st Division of the KONR, as Vlasov's army was now called. If you want to learn more about the army of Vlasov, the ROA, click here. And click here for my video about the Russians that served in the Waffen-SS. Thanks for watching and bye for now.